Let me begin by introducing myself. I'm Alan Barrett. I'm the director of the ESRI, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to today's event, which is titled The Private Rental Sector in Ireland Through the Pandemic and Beyond. Now, I think as you all know, this is a joint conference between ourselves, the ESRI and Threshold. So delighted to be partnering with our colleagues today, and gives me an opportunity to sort of give a special welcome to Aidan Hayden and John Mark McCafferty, who will both be sort of joining us later on in various ways. So I'm not an expert on housing. So sometimes when I'm opening conferences, I'm opening conferences on topics that I know an awful lot about, while I know a certain amount about housing. Very conscious that there's a real group of experts lined up. So I'm not going to try and sort of second guess any of the later contributions or anything like that. But just a couple of words, if I might, as director of the Institute. I've been director for 5 years, actually 6 years now. And one of the things I've been really pleased about is that I think the Institute has been more to the fore in terms of housing research and informing the housing debate in recent times. And later you'll be hearing from Conor O'Toole, of course, who's one of our lead researchers in the area. But I want to give some credit to the Department of Housing in this context, because they've been funding a lot of this research. And in fairness to the department, the research that the Institute has produced hasn't always been sort of comfortable for them and easy for them or anything like that. On occasions, it's been challenging. But nevertheless, they've demonstrated a real commitment to increasing the evidence base in this area. And making sure that the Institute gets to do the sort of policy relevant research in this area. So it's nice for me to be able to take just a moment to thank the Department of Housing for that. And another sort of great contributor in this area and sort of a sponsor of ESRI research has been the RTB. Partly, not totally, through the rental index. So again, great to be able to say a thank you to them, and later on Tom Dunn will be joining us as well. So again, good for me to take the opportunity to thank them. So very proud of what the ESRI has achieved in this area over the last few years. But I have to say, and this will be almost, it will sound like a little bit of a confession, I suppose. You know, as somebody who was trained as an economist and sort of submerged in economics and the way economists do things, I would have had a sort of a very economics-oriented perspective on the housing debate, and that would have been, in a sense, my frame of reference. But one of the really nice things about being director of the Institute is you essentially get exposed to many more perspectives, including the sociological perspective within the ESRI, but much more broadly than that. And I think if there is an area where I think economists do really good work, and I wouldn't take away from it for a second, but nevertheless, that the importance of the sort of the rich and the varied perspectives, this is an area where I think, you know, probably more so than any other area, you know, the importance of that richness and diversity of perspective is absolutely critical. And it's in that context, to be honest, that I'm sort of so excited about today's event. We really do have a mix of perspectives. Probably, you know, partly reflecting the fact that, you know, Threshold and the ESRI are kind of two different organizations, but I think in coming together, we've really put a program together that captures an awful lot. And I'm really expecting this to be a sort of a very rich and interesting day. If there's just two areas, and I'm not sure if they'll be touched on or not, but while I haven't sort of conducted research myself on housing specifically, there's a number of areas in my own research where housing is sort of intersected, and as a result, I sort of have a heightened awareness of these issues. And the first of these areas is about pension provision and population aging. So this is something that I have been involved with for a good number of years. And again, this is something that I think all the audience will be aware of, but I think it's worth restating. Always have a sense that Ireland's pension system, a lot of it is built on the notion that you essentially have a mortgage for a 20 or 30 year period, and that you pay down that mortgage over a period of time. And that by the time you hit retirement, you're an owner-occupier. And again, you know, I think a lot of our pension payments are kind of predicated on that sort of a model. But clearly, we all know that sort of model is fraying somewhat, and so there's a significant challenge there in the area of pensions. And another area that I've been involved in for the last few years, I've been a member of the Climate Change Advisory Council. And there's an interesting challenge there when we talk about sort of housing retrofits and such like, which I think everybody accepts are going to be a really, really part of meeting the climate challenge. Just that issue, you know, in a lot of the discussion, you'll often think seems to be predicated again on a sort of an owner-occupied response. That interaction of a sort of a growing rental sector and climate change mitigation measures, I'm not sure how well that has all been thought through. It may have been thought through very well, and there may be people with very sort of strong views and you know, strong policy proposals, but it's just something that I'd be interested to hear more about. So those are just sort of some of the things I'm interested in hearing about, and that I've no doubt we're going to hear a lot. Now, once again, because we're doing this sort of event remotely, some of the sort of side discussion may well happen over Twitter. So we've got a hashtag for the day. So if you want to just scribble this down, it's hashtag future of renting. Okay, hashtag future of renting. So if you do want to join in the conversation over Twitter, please do so. And we look forward to hearing what's being said. And then the other thing, of course, is there'll be lots of sort of opportunities for questions and answers. So from time to time, chairs, myself included, will be inviting you to submit questions through the Q&A function. And we'll be directing those questions then at the various speakers and panelists. So those are I think that my main introductory remarks, okay, getting some of the logistics. I've sort of commented, normally when I'm doing this in the Institute, I'd now be telling you where the bathrooms are and about the fire escapes and stuff like that, but obviously that's not entirely relevant. Okay, so my next task, having given the broad outlines, is to introduce our keynote speaker for today. And it is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Christine Whitehead. Professor Whitehead, Professor of Economics, Housing Economics, Emeritus at the Department of Economics of the London School of Economics. And I'm not going to sort of take a big amount of time sort of going through Professor Whitehead's CV or anything like that, but if I could make the following remark, Christine, you're kind of like a role model essentially for ESRI researchers. And by that I mean we have a sort of a mandate in the Institute that we try and do very, very high quality academic research, but highly policy oriented, and that we try and engage with the policy process as much as possible. And looking at your CV, I can see that you made a remarkable sort of academic contribution, but your work in the policy sphere too is just fantastic. Just noting, for example, your work with some parliamentary committees in the United Kingdom. So we're very much looking forward to your remarks. Really, really grateful, by the way, that you've taken time to join us. So I think you're going to talk to us maybe 20, 25 minutes or something like that. And then hopefully after that, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So with that, Professor Whitehead, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for your introduction. Yes, housing economics is no fun and no use if it doesn't have policy involved in it. And it is one of the great pleasures is to relate the theories to the practice. But what I'm going to talk about today is nearly always about practice and how the private rented sector has grown in the last few years and what's going on there. I think it's worth saying, because I'm very old, that in the 1980s, there were textbooks written about the fact that private renting would disappear, certainly before the end of that century. They couldn't have been more wrong. Actually, what's happening is that private renting is becoming more and more important across most of the world. Jean, could you, next slide if you could, please. It's growing across many, many countries, particularly in the senior world, in the sense that if we look back, what we had in the 70s, 60s was lots of social rented housing and the beginning of the growth of owner occupation. What's happened since the turn of the century has been massive declines in social rented housing, often transfers into owner occupation or indeed transfers into private rented sector. But it's mostly because it's become very difficult to enter owner occupation unless you've got significant deposit available. And on the supply side, rental housing has become a much more popular investment. So people want to be involved in private renting because they see a fairly stable and regular return. So in terms of scale, in England, private renting has more than doubled since 2000, and it now accounts for just over 1 in 5 households are in the private rented sector. The change is similar in Wales and Scotland, so while they've got very different backgrounds. But in Ireland, you have been growing more rapidly than any of the three. In 2018, the sector was 3 times the size that it was in 2000. And it's now accommodating almost as many people as it is in Britain. And I think that's really important because it's a very rapid change and people are pretty insecure about it. But the growth's everywhere. Spain, France, Denmark, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. We could mention a large number of other countries. The countries you don't see in there, just quickly, you do turn over. The countries you don't see in there is the emerging economies, partly because the data is too bad, but partly because governments are supporting owner occupation in those countries. So from a point of view of what we're talking about here, I think there are 3 big international topics. The first, and the one I'm going to spend most of the time on, is increasing regulation. We had a period when throughout the 80s and 90s, regulation of the private rented sector declined, and Ireland had almost none. It was the closest thing to a free market that we could see. But during the last 20 years, but much more in the last 10, we've had increasing rent controls or regulation and greater security of tenure implemented in Ireland, in Scotland, in Germany particularly, we'll come back to them, France, Spain, Norway, New Zealand, places which you don't think of as being likely to be interested in additional regulation, particularly, say, New Zealand, which 5 years ago would not have imagined having a regulated system. The second major topic is financialisation. That is to say, the role of institutional investors and particularly of overseas investors in the private rented sector. And this has caused a great deal of tension. Some groups seeing it as being absolutely disastrous, other groups seeing it as being the way forward to a stable long-term private rented sector. And it's the significant short-term gains and the fears of the people who are living in this housing which are causing most of the problems. Germany is the most clear example of it. Denmark actually has a Blackstone law. Sweden is currently looking at it in some detail. And I understand that in Ireland it has become significant that the shift away from smaller landlords to larger landlords is beginning to cause some difficulties. And the third issue, which I'm not going to really talk about, is short-term letting. Airbnb-style lettings taking over from the traditional private rented sector, particularly in tourist towns. The ones which always get mentioned are Lisbon, Barcelona, Edinburgh. And in these contexts, there's impact on the local community, and there's also impact on the capacity of what one might call normal people, people who live in the area, to get adequate accommodation. So moving on to regulation, the core issue has been that relationship between local incomes and rents and house prices has been broken in a large number of countries. And this is becoming a massive issue because at the same time, income distribution has normally been getting worse. So there is a significant proportion of people at the bottom end of the market who simply cannot afford that housing. And that, of course, has an implication for government support, which I'm not going to talk about here, but we might talk about in questions. Because of this worsening relationship between local incomes and rents, an increasing number of countries are bringing in regulation of those rents, or are looking so to do. The most notable is Germany, and particularly Berlin. But countries that have already legislated include, of course, Ireland, Scotland, France, Spain, Norway, very unlike Norwegians, and New Zealand. And the changes are mooted in a large number of other countries, parts of the USA, Canada, Australia, and of course in England, although we're not getting very far with them at the moment. And in all cases, I think the political interest lies in worsening housing shortages, particularly in major cities, concerns about the affordability of this local incomes, rents issue, insecurity of tenure, housing quality, and particularly in the press anyway, the issue of ownership. Is the housing being owned by foreigners? Is it being funded by foreigners? Is it being funded by large organizations whose only interest is in the capital value of the housing? But most fundamentally, it's increasing inequalities of income and job insecurity, which has made the private rented sector so much more important. Looking at a few examples, moving on to Germany and Berlin. Germany post-war had a completely free market in the private rented sector, but by the 1980s, they had moved to a system of what is called third generation rent control. What that means is that the rents are set by the market initially, but you've got an indefinite tenancy unless you break the tenancy rules, and you've got index rent rises within that tenancy. So when you take on your tenancy, you know what your rent is, you know you can stay there forever if you're good, and the rents will rise with the index. But since 2013, that has been unacceptable across the whole of Germany, not just Berlin. So they introduced additional rent controls in tight market cities. And the importance of this is that it started off as quite a small number of cities, but it is now 300 or so cities or municipalities across Germany. So, and many of those might be argued not to be pressured systems. You might note something here about Ireland. But what they've done is set initial rents to be limited to 10% above the local comparators, and to set the allowable rent increases from reduce them from 20% per annum to 15%. They seem pretty high. Now, that was definitely not enough for Berlin, where there were massive concerns about ownership and about the urban renewal program and the effect that this was having on gentrification. And so the institutional landlords were perceived of as buying up the stock, improving the stock, and as a result of that improvement, being allowed to increase rents by a very significant amount. So in 2020, Berlin introduced of itself a rent control system which included rent reduction. So it was a basic rent control system of existing rents or even lower if they were out of line with the local area. Of course, the Constitutional Court, the Federal Constitutional Court, ruled these out. And since the early part of this year, there has been that rent control has been removed. And very, very large numbers of people who were warned that their rents had gone down and they might go up again are now finding themselves with enormous payments to make, or very significant payments to make. So moving then to Ireland, which is in many ways has some of the same issues. Can I move to Ireland, please? Thank you. Again, it was, until the early 2000s, one of the most highly deregulated systems in Europe. Finland and England probably were comparable. What they did was move to a system by which rents would be in line with local market rents for similar properties. And that was seen as being the sort of basic principle that you ought to be able to observe other rents and you should get a rent which was comparable to that. And so it would be a simple market rent. But in 2016, you introduced rent pressure zones, and these put a maximum of 4% annually on the rent increases. Now, the proportion of tenancies in rent pressure zones, as the numbers of zones have gone up, has risen very significantly. Now it includes, those of us who are outsiders would say, quite a lot of areas which are not obviously pressured in the same way it was originally intended. But they're due to be replaced, and I think what is going to happen, I'm told this morning, is that there will be a rising, rent increases very closely related to consumer price index, at least for a short run. What's important, of course, is that under COVID restrictions, but I'll come back to right at the end, rents were frozen, notice periods suspended, evictions banned until mid-April 2021. So you are back in a post-COVID world. Then moving quickly on to Scotland. Scotland learned a lot from Ireland. You may not think so, but they introduced, they didn't intend to, they intended to introduce long fixed-term tenancies, but in fact introduced indefinite tenancies because that was generally more acceptable. Market rents on first letting, within tenancies, some very limited constraints on rent increases, and these were appealable to a rent officer. So it was much less strong than the Irish system. And the rent pressure zones, which are in the original specification, are not yet in place. So the principle is a rent stabilization approach. You get market rents, you get rents which rise with an index, combined with long-term security of tenure. However, Scotland also has 18 exceptions to that. So the number of ways you might find yourself not having a long-term tenancy are quite significant. Now, moving quickly to the other end of the spectrum, where the least regulated systems, I've taken three examples: Norway, New Zealand, and England. In Norway, was an entirely market system. They've now got a comparability system, as you were introducing. But interestingly, either side can ask for indexation. So you can get an indexed rent during your tenancy if you so wish, but the landlord can also ask for that index if they so wish. In New Zealand, they had the extreme version: short tenancies, 6 months, a year, no fault eviction, and market rents. And so they looked exactly like England 3 or 4 years ago. But in 2021, they've introduced turning fixed term tenancies into periodic tenancies, and all periodic tenancies can be continued indefinitely. Landlords cannot end a tenancy without reason, and rents may rise only once a year, and they will move very slowly, well, fairly quickly probably, to a rent index process. In England, we haven't done any of this yet. We've got ASTs, as short hold tenancies, 6 months to a year, no fault eviction, and market rents. The government promised to change this well over 2 years ago. The legislation is not yet even envisaged. So moving away from rent regulation, what I just saying is the impacts first before I move away. There isn't an awful lot of evidence, and particularly in Germany, to some extent in Ireland, that it has really changed anything very much. It certainly hasn't changed the impact on investors' preparedness to invest. That is partly, I think, because, particularly in Berlin, the extreme suggestions have not been implemented. But it's also because relatively small numbers of tenants actually appeal their rents. So there is overall, even in these markets which look as though they're heavily controlled, there is an agreement between landlord and tenant which is reasonably comfortable. But there's also evidence of significant increasing administrative costs and considerable concerns about data quality. That's particularly true in Germany. I think in Ireland, you've done a good job at collecting data. And so we've got a reasonable baseline for evaluating what is going on. So I think, there's a massive discussion about rent controls. There's a massive changes in legislation. The reality on the ground may not be quite as different as the textbooks might say. So the second major interest is financialisation, and I'm just going to ask whether it's good or bad. Obviously, the press has very strong views about that, but if we look at government policy and other economic arguments and so on, it's not a straightforward issue. In many countries which were looking to expand the provision of private rented sector, what's difficult is to get new build into private rented sector because the costs are very high at the beginning. So what a number of countries feel, UK is one of them, is that international money, institutional money will improve the management and add to the stock. And that there's a very considerable interest in investing in purpose-built private rented accommodation. The UK has led it in Europe, Australia is in that, and many countries are involved in it. So the core issue is, do we get new private rented sector stock without having some long-term funding to make that possible? And there's consistent discussion of sheds of money out there to do it. And if that worries some people, it helps others. But I think there is a really core issue that new build is going to be in the top the best 60% and possibly the top 40% of the housing stock. And that being the case, it is going to be at the top end of the rental market. And so it's not something which is significantly helping the ordinary private tenant in a local area where rents are significantly above their capacities to pay. But what is true is that institutional landlords state that they're entirely happy with the rent stabilization regulatory system. So longer term security within tenancy indexation, as long as these are properly enforced and aren't changed by political will. And that there are certain accepted exceptions to indefinite security, such as students. But most of the discussion in the papers is about the bad side, because it separates house prices and rents from local incomes. The experience in Germany in particular has been that they've bought up properties which have been in relatively poor condition. They have improved it, and within the regulatory framework of the German system have been therefore able to increase rents by very significant amounts. And these have excluded traditional tenants, new entrants into the system. And there is at the moment a campaign, which is not going to get anywhere, I suspect, to expropriate the property of one of the largest landlords in Berlin, private landlords, because they are seen as being highly undesirable. But the more general discussion, which is all over the place, is about whether housing is an asset, a capital asset, which needs to have a reasonable return, needs to be maintained, needs to be stable in a low interest rate world, and housing as a human right, which argues that these sorts of economic aspects should not be at the core of the way in which we provide housing. And I think what is worth noting in that case is that part of the reason why this is so important at the present time is just that interest rates are so low, that therefore capital values are so high, and that is inherent in a market system. And then finally, I'm just going to skip short-term lettings. Major tourist cities is having a massive effect on the difficulties of implementing externality type rules, so that heavy parties, etc., don't ruin everybody. But the problems of regulation are very, very difficult to implement, and it hasn't usually been possible to ensure tax revenues are properly connected. And there's an adverse effect on the local communities, higher rents in the private rented sector, negative impact on the local economy. And of course, COVID has caused everything to be turned upside down, and that has made life even more difficult. And then finally, just because the title of this paper was private rented sector is part of a global housing system. Well, yes, it is very, very much part of a global housing system. And in the advanced world, it is an increasing part of that system. But in a COVID world, most of the countries did much the same thing. They introduced suspensions of both notice periods, sometimes extending those notice periods as well. So we had suspension plus an extension to 6 months of the notice period, and evictions. So there was an exception for ASB, and there was an exception for domestic abuse, and there were exceptions for one or two other egregious issues. But basically, everything was put on hold. Then, of course, the issue is, was that actually implemented? And the evidence, at least in England, is that it was fairly implemented. What the problems were in case of lodges or sofa surfers or others who had informal relationships, and those break down quite a lot and ended up with people either on the street or in temporary accommodation. Some countries have helped pay tenants to pay their rent with low interest loans, which are then transferred to the landlord. Others have just left the landlords to cope. But the reality has been that the vast majority of people have actually paid their rent on time. So there is a minority of landlords in real difficulty and a minority of tenants. There's also in most countries been some recognition of a problem of rents by increases in income-related support. So on the average, there really hasn't been that much of a problem caused by these suspensions. People haven't just said, well, we won't pay the rent. But there is a problem of unwinding this situation for that group of people who haven't been able to pay rent or haven't paid their rent. And there's a potential for a long period of uncertainty as these COVID-specific arrangements wind down, and most legal systems are under enormous strain. So COVID hasn't made anything better, and I think I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks so much, Christine. That was really fascinating for a number of reasons, including the simple point that it's interesting to know that internationally, a lot of the issues that we're discussing in Ireland, and I guess maybe sometimes we can be insular and you think you're the only country dealing with the sort of issues that you've sort of highlighted, but clearly this isn't the case. So I'm going to kick off with a question, but I'm also going to invite the folks viewing, if they want to submit questions to the Q&A function. And again, we have a number of panelists. If they want to ask questions, I can invite them directly. But if I could start, and when I was doing my introductory sort of remarks, I was talking about the economics profession having a lot to say on this area, but other perspectives being important too. But one of the things that specifically in regard to regulation, okay, it often strikes me that when we teach our introductory economics classes, okay, and we're trying to explain markets, we often use two examples, okay? One is minimum wages and the other is rent controls. And we kind of instill in people's heads almost on, their first day in a university class that minimum wages, are bad things because it reduces employment, and that rent controls are really bad ideas because they just reduce rental supply. And I've often thought that it's almost like we're hardwiring into sort of a generation of people, or just this sort of notion, and through these very, very simple models that life is very difficult in these areas. Now, I have to say, my main training was a labor economist, and there's been a lot of evolving work on minimum wages over time, including by colleagues at the ESRI, which has tended to show that, well, actually, the world doesn't fall apart if you increase minimum wages within reasonable parameters. But in the housing area, it really does strike me still that I think there is kind of a mindset that almost starts from the position that if you do anything in this area, you are definitely going to cause difficulties. Now, if I was to summarize what you were saying, it seems to be that the evidence is certainly far from clear that if you increase regulation in this area, that you choke off supply. So that's sort of one point. But it seems to me that in an awful lot of the discussion, people aren't actually engaging with the empirical evidence. They're just reverting back to what people like you and me might have done in terms of teaching them in the introductory classes. So can I get your, again, if you want to say a little bit more about the actual empirical evidence, but is there a difficulty in having this discussion because there's, this very hardwired preconceived notion that this can only be damaging?
I think, well, the first thing I think is something which you and I should talk about in a different context, is that there's a continual discussion about why labour markets are able to produce good models and write empirical evidence and get some answers out, while housing never seems to be quite at that stage. And I think this is significantly about market structure. I think, when you're in a labour market, you've got a very clear understanding of what you as a worker are meant to be getting, etc. And the employers are larger on the whole. And on the whole, the housing market has been individual landlords and individual tenants sort of wandering around in a very difficult market to some extent. And we do not have very clear-cut models. We have first-year models which say rent control should reduce the supply, but we do not have either the modeling which allows us to ask which questions we should be answering and what data we should have, or the actual capacity to provide that empirical evidence. And I mean, just to take a very obvious example at the present time, Mr. Boff, who is the Conservative leader in GLA, is saying, well, this situation, current COVID situation, is absolute proof that it's complete nonsense to have rent controls, because we know that Berlin rents have been going up under rent control much more rapidly than London's rents have been going up, which is true, starting from an extremely low base as compared to London. And secondly, that if you had rent regulations, rent stabilization, which would relate it to inflation in one way or another, or to consumer price index of one form or another, then you would actually be trying to put rents down at the present time. And that is not at all what we understand by this system. So it's a very tense world, I think, in this issue. And I think also, that's probably wrong, but in labour markets, what you do during the day is fairly well defined. But when you look at, say, German rural areas, each individual unit will be different, and what you're trying to take into account is different. And this does lead to it being that much more complicated. And certainly what the Germans have found is that they've got a very simple way of trying to compare housing, but that it hasn't generated the sorts of outcomes which they've been expecting.
Okay, thanks. I better not. I'm tempted to monopolize the discussion, but I better not. And I'm going to take a couple of questions. One of our parliamentarians, Ona Bryn, who is a TD for Sinn Féin, has submitted a question. So I just want to ask Owen's question. So firstly, he says, great talk, which of course we all agree with. And he's interested to hear more about the impact of rent regulation. Now, that question just disappeared from my screen, but I think I can remember it. It's the impact of rent regulation, specifically on institutional investment. Now, again, you touched on this in your talk, but it's the standard, again, the mantra that if you do this, the institutional group will pull out. So I think that's essentially the question that Owen is raising.
Yeah, I think almost all the discussion about this is in terms of what we call first generation rent controls. In 1939, we all put on rent controls. We set them at the rent that they were in 1939, and in some cases in 1955 they were still at the same rent. So you weren't adjusting in any sense in the first generation system, and that was the one which was right across the world, and it was the one which meant that over a period of time you got no improvements. You had enormous problems of little old ladies living in 4-bedroom flat houses because they are not going to move out, and all those types of issues. What I think is the discussion now, in the main, though take Berlin as an example where it isn't, is that we're talking about third generation. So we do take account of costs and how those are changing. We take account of what is happening in the inflationary world, etc. So what you're being offered is an initial market rent and then changes linked to an index which is seen to some extent maintain that income. And if that is done very carefully, all you're really doing is spreading change over a longer period of time. You should end up with the normal rate of return rather than something which goes up too much because there's a lot of sudden additional demand. So I think that the traditional arguments by everybody except economists is about the first generation rent control, but that the reality is that we're not talking about that type of rent control, and therefore institutional investors are comfortable about how they can to maintain that, assuming that they think they've got a central government which will stick with the same rules.
Sure, very interesting. Thanks for that. Aideen Hayden, I know your hand is up and you're on the panel, so you can actually turn on your camera and mic. Would you like to do that and ask your question?
Yes, hi Alan, thank you very much, and thank you Christine for a really wonderful presentation. One of the features of the Irish market in the last while has been the loss of small-scale landlords into the market, into the sector. In other words, people who may have bought properties back in 2004, 5, 6, 7, when we had a large influx of buy-to-let investors, are now leaving the market again, particularly as house prices have risen to a point where they're able to leave without significant losses. And certainly within Threshold, that's the major reason why people are coming into the organisation having received notices of termination. You made the point that new build is typically coming in at the higher end of the market and therefore isn't going to meet the need of maybe low to lower middle income groups. I'm just wondering, Christine, if small landlords in other jurisdictions, first of all, is it an issue generally of them leaving the market? And also, if it is an issue, what steps are being taken in other jurisdictions to address this issue, or if it's perceived as being an issue that needs to be addressed?
I think it is perceived as being an issue, but where you stand on it is really quite complicated. I mean, a significant proportion, a very large proportion of small landlords actually have good relations with their tenants. And if a tenant says, I really can't manage that, then quite often they will say that's fine. And in fact, the regular information shows that landlords do not put up rents for tenants regularly, and may indeed never put the rents up for the tenant itself, but for the next tenant. So small landlords of that type are ideal for tenants. But there is within that, the overall group, a set of small landlords who are incapable, undesirable, etc., etc. And I think most governments think that if you could get to a situation where the landlord had 4 or 5 properties rather than 1 property, had to take it seriously as a business, but with a general regulatory framework, they would be fairly happy with that. But I think the emphasis over the last few years has been we need new build, and that means we need significant investment by large-scale investors who will not be the immediate. There will be a management rather than a finance. Well, will be a financier and a management separately, and they will run it more efficiently. And if you have a third generation rent control system, I think that can be made to work. But I do think there is a real concern that renting is a local thing. And if what you've got is the money coming in from halfway around the world, you haven't got the same control. So it's not straightforward. There are many different aspects.
Okay, I'm going to go back to some of the questions that have been submitted over the Q&A function, and I'm going to try and sort of summarize and bring some of them together. But again, Christine, because some of the issues I guess you've been flagging is to the extent if there is sort of institutional investment, say, in an area, it might be catering for the higher end of the market. And so some people have been asking about this question then about what should be the state response in terms of sort of providing more affordable housing, especially in local areas. And I guess the question then is really sort of being driven here about this idea, you know, should there be much more sort of, you know, extensive state intervention, essentially through building, I'm guessing, with a particular view on the sort of the lower end or the more affordable end of the market, if I can put it like that. And again, the people asking the questions are really thinking, and I think it's again your points about gentrification and stuff like that. There's an interest in getting a handle on how you cater for more affordable housing in certain areas where gentrification is happening. So sorry, that's a bit of a garbled effort at trying to get some of the questions together, but I hope it makes some sense.
It does make sense, but it's a very, very difficult one to answer because, I mean, basically since 1980, many countries have gone the same way as Britain, only we've done it rather more extremely. So we got rid of our affordable housing, or a significant proportion of our affordable rented housing, by selling it to the tenant. Now, that in itself might have looked like a very good idea, but now 40% of those are in the 40% plus are in the private rented sector. And a lot of them are being let back to local authorities at rather high prices in order to accommodate temporary accommodation or affordable housing. So the reality is that with an uneven distribution of income, we're going to have a proportion of tenants who cannot afford to pay the rent themselves. In Britain, that's usually around 30%. And we've got a choice. We either give them income support or we give them housing. And many people feel that as we're short of housing, it would be a good idea just to put the money into building affordable homes and promise not to sell them off. And over a 60-year period, that will probably be cheaper than the income-related support, which you would have to have in a market system. But there is no getting away from the fact that housing is not going to be, adequate housing is not going to be affordable for people at the bottom end of the income scale.
Okay, that's an interesting, succinct way and takeaway point actually for a lot of people. Okay, another one of the panelists, my colleague Conor O'Toole, was hoping to ask a question. So Conor, if you want to turn on the mic and unmute, which you've now done, so feel free to ask away.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Christine. I'd like to echo Alan's welcome, Christine, to the Virtual Institute. I really appreciate your contributions today. I think for somebody who works in this area regularly, I've consulted your work on numerous occasions, and for anyone who's interested in understanding housing affordability, Christine has an incredible book that you should check out, which covers all of these issues. So my question is kind of comes back to something you said earlier in your talk, and it's about the fact that many countries post the global financial crisis have had this kind of structural lowering in the home ownership rate. And I'm struck by a paper that you did for the OECD a number of years ago, which tied this debate to changes in kind of bank regulation, particularly the macroprudential instruments that have occurred globally following the financial crisis. And I wonder whether you'd be able to kind of elaborate on that change in structural home ownership and whether this is something that has impacted the rental sector's increase in the share of tenure over time.
Yeah, I think, you know far more about it probably than I do now, but obviously post the financial crisis, governments I think really across the world, decided that they would not worry as much as they should have done about the Treasury side of the financial institutions, but we should worry about the consumer side. Now, I think England was not atypical in having almost no problems of default on the consumer side and having significant problems of bailout on the Treasury side. Germany was a much more extreme case where nearly all of the regional financial institutions had to be bailed out. But the result of it was that we put in a set of regulations about the deposits that people must make, the ratio of to income, etc., which has tended to exclude very large numbers of people from, potentially exclude very large numbers of people from getting a mortgage. So for instance, your income must be secure. So if you've got a job which is 20,000 quid basic, but another 20,000 quid extra, which you get almost automatically, then you can't get a mortgage on the second half. But what the OECD project found, and I think it's true, I wouldn't I, did it, is that to a very significant extent, up till that time, which was what, 2016, I think, the regulatory environment had not been the significant issue. The significant issue was that people had insecure jobs and they had insecure income within those jobs, and therefore they couldn't actually meet even the traditional requirements. So you ended up in a situation where you had to have the bank of mum and dad working very hard if you were going to get into the owner-occupied market. Now, whether that, I think it's a study which would be well worth redoing in, say, 2 years' time, when we've got through the furlough and the sort of structural effects of COVID, or at least partially, to see whether that is still the case. But you know, if you are a PhD student in France, you will have had grants, but you will have absolutely no chance of a secure job which will allow you to pay for a normal mortgage. It doesn't matter whether it's France or Italy or indeed Britain. So I do think that the issue is that I think that there are the structure of how financial institutions have been made to operate has not been helpful. But I don't think it's been the core issue. The core issue is insecurity in the labour market.
Thank you.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of it, but there's a question here I really want to ask you, Christine. So for quite a while in Ireland, I don't know if this applies in other countries, but there's been a discussion about whether or not the right to housing should be enshrined in the Constitution.
Yeah.
Okay, now sometimes I'm obviously not a lawyer. I never really have a sense of how much meaning something like that has. But I just wonder, is there an international discussion around such, and is there any experience internationally of what, you know, the value or otherwise of enshrining the right to housing in some sort of basic law?
I think I'm in roughly your position on this, but clearly the financialisation tensions are about human rights on one side and economics on the other, really. This is a use of resources and as a capital asset. It is legislated in a large number of countries. The United Nations has made a great deal of emphasis on the human right of adequate housing. It's massively difficult to define in a way which doesn't either incentivize breaking up households or provide the money to enable it to happen, because the human right is the human right. It doesn't provide the rules and regulations or the money by which it can become a proper a reality. So yes, it's there. It's an aspiration rather than a reality. Yeah. And I think we should be responsible enough to be able to set a housing system in any country which accepts that everybody has a right to be in a safe, secure accommodation, and make that happen rather than tie it to the human right. But the honest answer is, you know, I had a colleague many years ago who used to say you have only one human right, and that is 6 foot of land to be buried in. That's not where we are now.
Okay, and just the very last question, if I can pose them again, you kind of raised it in the talk. I guess we're all thinking in terms now about the sort of transition, hopefully, out of the COVID situation, out of the extraordinary income supports. And you made reference, clearly it's the same in the UK, both through income supports and various interventions of the rental market. We probably have a sort of an artificial situation at the moment. But as we unwind a lot of these support, difficulties are going to emerge. And I'm just wondering if you want to just reflect for a moment, what are the things you're really, really worried about in the UK in this context? And what should we be worrying about in Ireland then by extension?
Well, I've done a fair amount of work around this, and I think the answer is actually Roosevelt is fear itself. It's the fact that we're leaving very, very large numbers of people who feel even more insecure than they did, because they haven't been able to pay the rent, because they don't know what the job is going to look like, etc. I don't think, at least looking at England, I don't think our legal system can cope with actually evicting large numbers of people. And I don't actually think there's a large number of landlords who will want to do that. And that is one of the worries, that if you move to an institutional landlord situation, when there might be a rule from on high, everybody must be evicted if. And that's one reason for worrying about it. But I think the honest answer is, I think it's just going to be a long, slow burn. There are going to be lots of people who managed to sort themselves out. There's lots of people who went home to mum, whether it's in Bulgaria or Ireland or England. There's lots of people who have walked away, and the landlords just had to deal with that. But there are also lots of people who are more insecure than they were. And I think we need to provide at least some capacity to support people in that way. But I just think it's going to be 2 or 3 years of a real discomfort.
Okay, well, listen, thank you for that.